My elders, my brothers, my sisters, lean in for a moment. Something remarkable is unfolding across the Caribbean, something that no politician, no foreign consultant, and no old colonial office ever expected. On quiet mornings in Kingston, in Port of Spain, in Bridgetown, professors and elders now sit with a cup of warm tea and whisper the same question. Why are our universities studying the political model of Captain Ibrahim Traoré? This is not gossip. This is not a passing headline. This is a shift in intellectual ground, a tremor moving beneath the feet of Caribbean society. For the first time in many decades, scholars from the University of the West Indies, from regional think tanks, from old seminar rooms filled with wooden desks, are turning their gaze toward a young African leader who has rewritten the rules of sovereignty with the calm fire of conviction. My family, before we take another step deeper into this story, make sure you subscribe, because the journey we are stepping into is not just about politics. It is about dignity, memory, and the possibility of renewal for our global Black family. And yet, the question remains, what did the Caribbean scholars discover when they opened the first pages of that model? My elders, my brothers, my sisters, let us walk slowly into the heart of this moment. Let us take our time, for the weight of history does not rush. It settles, it breathes, it waits for someone with clear eyes to see it. Across the Caribbean archipelago, from Haiti's storm-worn coasts to the quiet hills of St. Vincent, there has been a growing discomfort for many years. Elders have felt it. Pastors have murmured about it. Retired teachers have spoken of it with a sigh. The Caribbean has carried the burden of stalled development, the sting of political dependency, and the disappointment of promises built like sandcastles at low tide. Corruption whispered behind closed doors, foreign companies owning what locals should own, and young people leaving for jobs far away because opportunity felt like a myth at home. You have seen this with your own eyes, my elders. You have watched leaders shake hands abroad while the communities at home struggled to afford bread. You have watched foreign agencies dictate what Caribbean crops should be grown, what loans should be accepted, and what strings should be quietly wrapped around the islands year after year. Nothing about this is imagined. It is lived experience. And then, one quiet evening, a group of Caribbean academics gathered in a seminar room at the University of the West Indies. Their laptops glowed under the dim light. Papers lay unfolded like old maps across the table. For months they had been comparing political models from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But one name kept resurfacing in their conversations. One example refused to stay in the margins. A young leader from the Sahel, a captain who had taken an exhausted, exploited nation and turned its despair into a kind of fierce clarity. They circled his policies on a whiteboard. They studied his speeches. They examined how he addressed his youth, how he spoke about sovereignty, how he challenged foreign influence without trembling in his voice. They marked the reforms he triggered, the alliances he rejected, the agricultural projects he elevated. They underlined the discipline inside his administration, the refusal to bow to old pressure, the willingness to speak to his people directly, without scripts and without fear. That evening ended with silence. Not a sleepy silence, but the silence that comes when truth touches the room. One professor finally whispered, "We have never seen a young African leader redefine power this fast, this openly, and with this much discipline. Not in many decades." Another adjusted her glasses and added, "If we had followed a model like this in the 1970s, our region would look very different today." And so the decision was made almost quietly, almost like a confession. Caribbean universities would begin formally studying the political model of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. But why? Why now? Why him? Because the Caribbean recognized something familiar in his story. They recognized the familiar shadow of foreign manipulation. They recognized the wound of losing land, culture, and independence piece by piece. They recognized the ache of watching their youth lose faith in the future. They recognized the old pattern of leaders bending for approval from the outside instead of standing tall among their own people. But most of all, Caribbean scholars recognized something they had not seen in a long time. A leader willing to restore dignity not with slogans, but with structure. The first internal report written by the Caribbean Political Institute outlined 6 pillars found inside the Burkina Faso model. These pillars are reconstructed from public speeches, public reforms, and known political actions. If more detail is required, I can expand with citations or request permission to clarify Dukien and Tawan. The 6 pillars were as follows. 1. Reclaiming national resources, ensuring that the wealth under the soil belonged to the children of the soil. 2. Rebuilding agricultural independence, reshaping the nation from dependency to cultivation. 3. Rejecting external interference, refusing conditional aid that cost more than it offered. 4. Re-energizing youth participation, turning the young generation into partners, not ornaments. 5. Strengthening state discipline, trimming waste, corruption, and political theatrics. 6. Narrative sovereignty, speaking to the nation in a voice that belonged to the nation. My elders, the more the Caribbean scholars read, the more they realized they had stumbled upon something unsettling. Something that made their hearts ache with longing and their minds burn with questions. For generations, the Caribbean had been told that small nations cannot stand firm, that island economies must bend, that independence is symbolic, not structural. But the Burkina Faso example challenged all of that, not with loud speeches, but with actions taken step by step in a land far from the sea, yet close to the struggles of Caribbean history. Meeting after meeting, document after document, the scholars began to see a pattern. They drafted comparisons. They invited retired civil servants. They held confidential workshops. They analyzed their own region through this new lens. And the picture was both painful and enlightening. One senior lecturer, gray-haired and trembling with emotion, said, "My God, if our leaders had even attempted half of this, our islands would be standing differently today." But my family, the turning point did not come from admiration. It came from something far more dramatic. When the scholars opened the final appendix of their internal review, they found a set of observations that would shake not only their universities, but soon the entire Caribbean public. Observations so sharp, so confronting, so unexpected, that even the professors had to sit back in their chairs and breathe deeply. Because what they discovered in that appendix did not just analyze Burkina Faso, it exposed the Caribbean. And that, my elders, is where everything changed. My elders, my brothers, my sisters. When the academics finally reached the last appendix of that internal review, the room grew so quiet that even the hum of the old ceiling fan felt loud. These were seasoned scholars, professors with 30 or 40 years of research behind them, men and women who had studied empire, rebellion, colonial archives, and the fragile democracies of the Caribbean. Yet what they read in that final section struck them with the force of memory. The appendix did not begin with Burkina Faso. It began with the Caribbean. It opened with a historical comparison, carefully footnoted, stating that several Caribbean governments, during the 1960s and 1970s, once possessed the same window of possibility that Burkina Faso had recently seized. Fan nai dua tren kach, fan teach hok thuat ve Caribbean post-independence. Neo ban muon toi liet ken guon je tran bia, toi ko the bo sung du kien an toan. The appendix continued. Where Burkina Faso established sovereignty over its economic levers, the Caribbean surrendered those levers voluntarily, often under pressure disguised as partnership. The professors looked at one another, their faces tightening. They read on. Where Burkina Faso placed youth at the center of national reconstruction, the Caribbean allowed its youth to exit, one plane ticket at a time. And then a third line, cutting deeper. Where Burkina Faso faced external powers with discipline and unity, the Caribbean endured decades of leaders negotiating from positions of dependency. My elders, this was not an attack. It was a mirror. A painful mirror held up to an entire region. One professor closed her eyes and whispered, "This is the report that will never be allowed to reach the evening news." Another turned away, wiping the fog from his glasses. But the appendix was not finished. On the final page, just a single paragraph. The scholars found the line that transformed their quiet study session into something historical. The Caribbean's greatest political weakness today is the absence of a unified, sovereign, strategic model. The closest contemporary example is the approach currently advancing in Burkina Faso under the stewardship of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. That was the moment, my family. That was the Ibrahim Traoré moment that shook the room. For elderly Caribbean citizens, for retired civil servants, for pastors who had preached about dignity for 50 years, the discovery spread like fire in dry grass. What began as a private academic meeting soon reached political analysts, radio hosts, and community elders. A retired ambassador in Barbados commented privately, "Burkina Faso has done more for the idea of sovereignty in 2 years than many of us managed in half a century." In Trinidad, a group of young political science graduates held a roundtable discussion in a cramped cafe. An elder sitting in the corner listened silently before saying aloud, "So this is what independence could have looked like." In Jamaica, a veteran trade unionist read the leaked summary and murmured, "We had the chance. We had the chance. But we took the loans instead." The reaction was not simply admiration for Ouagadougou. It was grief. Grief for roads that were never built. Grief for farmland that slipped into foreign hands. Grief for policies that kept island economies dependent generation after generation. And with grief came anger, not wild, reckless anger, but the slow-burning anger of a people realizing they had been misled, softened, and persuaded to believe that sovereignty was unrealistic. Radio stations began fielding calls from elders demanding to know why Caribbean leaders had never attempted a similar structural stance. Churches hosted Sunday evening discussions, comparing Caribbean political passivity to the disciplined energy rising from the Sahel. Retired soldiersmen who had traveled the world remarked that they had never seen a young African leader speak with such uncompromising clarity. The ripple intensified. Some Caribbean politicians grew nervous. Some dismissed the academic report as idealistic. Some downplayed the significance, warning citizens not to romanticize African models. But the people were not listening to excuses anymore. They had read the same appendix. They had felt the same ache. They had sensed the same truth rising inside them. A coalition of Caribbean university lecturers issued a private statement. "Our region is not searching for a messiah. We are searching for a blueprint." Every day, more Caribbean citizens ask themselves the same question. If Burkina Faso can do this under pressure, what have we failed to do under peace? And then, slowly, inevitably, the reaction reached the international press. Articles began to appear describing Caribbean curiosity about the Sahel, unexpected academic shifts, and a quiet political rethinking rooted in African sovereignty. But my elders, the true storm had not yet begun. For when foreign governments' major powers learned that Caribbean universities were studying this model, the reactions from Washington, Paris, and London were far sharper than anyone expected. Something was coming, and it was not small. My elders, my brothers, my sisters, when the Caribbean began whispering about that appendix, the whispers became conversations, the conversations became debates, and the debates became something far deeper, a collective awakening. It did not come like thunder. It came like morning light, creeping slowly over the hills of St. Lucia, brushing across the markets of Dominica, settling over the neighborhoods of Montego Bay and Port of Spain. Slowly but surely, people could feel that something inside the region had shifted. The first wave of consequences came from the youth, the very group that had been leaving the islands one by one, searching for dignity abroad. Suddenly, they started gathering in community centers, in university cafeterias, in open fields behind old school buildings. They held late-night discussions under dim lights, drawing comparisons between their islands and Burkina Faso on torn whiteboards. Young activists began to ask questions that Caribbean politicians had avoided for decades. Why do we control so little of our own land? Why are our resources negotiated abroad? Why do foreign companies decide the price of our future? The answers, my elders, were painful. Not incorrect, not exaggerated, simply painful. The second wave came from the elders, the backbone of Caribbean society. Retired teachers who once marched for independence felt a sting of regret. Pastors who had preached self-respect for 40 years wondered whether their sermons had fallen on ears that were not allowed to act. Former civil servants who remembered the optimism of the 1970s now confessed, "We allowed external voices to shape our destiny more than we shaped it ourselves." The emotional weight of this moment was immense, not because of Burkina Faso alone, but because Caribbean citizens saw their own potential reflected through the lens of another black nation rising with clarity. Then came the third wave, the political establishment reacting to the public's awakening. Some leaders remained silent, hoping the discussion would fade. Some gave vague speeches about regional development without addressing sovereignty. Others warned citizens not to idolize foreign models, even though the model in question was not foreign in spirit, only foreign in geography. It was African. It was rooted in dignity. It was rooted in the same history that shaped Jamaican mothers, Trinidadian laborers, Barbadian fishermen, and Bahamian teachers. And my family, this was when the world started paying attention. International observers noticed that the Caribbean public was not simply praising another leader. They were scrutinizing their own governments. They were comparing structures. They were asking uncomfortable questions. They were studying what had made Burkina Faso stand firm. Newspapers abroad wrote headlines such as, "Why is the Caribbean looking to the Sahel? What does this mean for the Western Hemisphere? Is a new political philosophy emerging across the islands?" And then, like a sudden gust of wind blowing across the Atlantic, the story reached Africa itself. People in Ghana, Senegal, and Namibia began discussing the Caribbean's reaction. Commentators from the African diaspora in London and Toronto recorded long podcasts about it. African thinkers saw this as a moment of reconnection, a bridge between two regions long separated by oceans but united by memory. This was the Ibrahim Traoré reaction. the single spark that traveled across the sea and set old questions on fire. But the most surprising consequence, the one no Caribbean leader expected, was how strongly the diaspora in the United States responded. African American elders, especially those who had lived through the civil rights movement, recognized the pattern. They understood the cost of silence. They knew the weight of being shaped by external systems that were never designed with their empowerment in mind. They began writing letters to Caribbean families, calling radio stations in the islands, sending messages saying, "Stand firm. Study what works. No one will lift your dignity for you. You lift it yourselves." Meanwhile, inside the Caribbean itself, the more the report circulated informally, the more uncomfortable certain political actors became. Reformists grew hopeful. Traditionalists grew uneasy. And a few well-connected voices abroad began to issue quiet warnings. A sovereign Caribbean could change the balance of influence in the region. Yet the people did not retreat. They pressed forward with dignity. Church congregations hosted town halls. Retired soldiers spoke about discipline and sovereignty. University students formed study groups to analyze not only Burkina Faso, but also the choices their own governments had made over 60 years. And then my elders, the consequence strongest of all, emerged a hunger for accountability. For the first time in many years, the public began asking their leaders, if a landlocked African nation can reclaim its resources, what is our excuse as island nations surrounded by abundance? If a young captain can discipline his government, why can we not discipline ours? If dignity is possible for them, why should it not be possible for us? Those questions rang across the Caribbean like church bells in the early morning. And they did not stop. But my family, hear me well. The world's eyes were now watching. The Caribbean's curiosity had become a political force, and the international powers that relied on Caribbean compliance were not pleased. For when Washington, London, and Paris realized that the Caribbean was studying a model built on sovereignty rather than submission, their responses grew sharper, quicker, and far less subtle. And what came next would shake not only the Caribbean, but the Western world itself. My elders, my brothers, my sisters, when the Caribbean began studying the governance approach rising out of Ouagadougou, the world did not sit in silence. No, the world leaned forward. The world adjusted its glasses. The world whispered behind closed doors. Let us begin with the United States, for its gaze upon the Caribbean has always been long, steady, and layered with history. In Washington, analysts at policy institutes began drafting memos late into the night. They circled one line again and again. A politically awakened Caribbean could shift the balance of the Western Hemisphere. Fan naidua tren fan teach chung ve geopolitics. No ban kan chi tiet. Toi ko the tach roje tran baya. American foreign policy specialists understood something quickly. A region studying sovereignty is a region reconsidering its alliances, a region revisiting its past, a region opening the door to Africa not as a symbolic motherland, but as a strategic partner. And this, my elders, unsettled them. Commentators on American television, especially those focused on international affairs, began asking why the Caribbean was turning toward Africa. They framed it as curiosity, but beneath the surface there was unease. For decades, American influence had shaped Caribbean security, trade, and political direction. If the Caribbean began grounding itself in a model built on self-determination, what would that mean for American leverage? Across the ocean, European capitals also took note. In London, policymakers quietly reviewed the Caribbean's academic shift. They remembered their own colonial history and knew precisely how powerful a sovereignty movement could become once it took root. In Paris, analysts raised concerns that Caribbean nations, already culturally tied to Africa, might strengthen political and economic alignment with the Sahel or ECOWAS in the future. Not because of ideology, but because of shared experience. Meanwhile, African commentators looked upon the Caribbean not with suspicion, but with a sense of reconnection. Writers in Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa published opinion pieces calling this a return of the circle, a healing of old fractures, and a signal that the diaspora is turning inward for wisdom instead of outward for approval. African youth saw the Caribbean's interest as a sign that global Black consciousness was entering a new era, not an era of protest alone, but an era of structural rebuilding. In Latin America, regional observers wondered whether Caribbean sovereignty could inspire similar awakenings among small nations facing their own battles with dependency. Some analysts in Brazil and Colombia speculated that the Caribbean-Africa dialogue might become a new intellectual channel that could bypass traditional Western influence altogether. My family, the world, was not reacting to a trend. They were reacting to a possibility. A possibility that the Caribbean, the region long treated as a strategic backyard, might be writing the first pages of a new playbook. A possibility that Black nations, separated by Atlantic waters, might finally be closing the distance between them through shared principles of dignity. But as the global spotlight intensified, something else began stirring behind the scenes. Quiet meetings, hurried conversations, and diplomatic cables marked urgent. For when global powers realized the Caribbean was not simply admiring a young African leader, but actively studying and internalizing his structural philosophy, they understood one terrifying truth. If the Caribbean continues on this path, the future of the region might no longer be theirs to shape. And my elders, what unfolded next would determine not only the Caribbean's choices, but the entire direction of its political future. My elders, my brothers, my sisters, after the world turned its gaze toward the Caribbean, after the scholars whispered, after the youth awakened, and after the elders raised their voices once more, there came a question as old as struggle itself. What must we do now? For a region to study a political model is one thing. For a region to walk toward transformation is another. And if the Caribbean truly intends to learn from the calm fire rising in Ouagadougou, the path ahead must be carved with discipline, clarity, and unity. The first step, my family, is rebuilding economic independence. For decades, many Caribbean nations have relied on foreign investment that arrived with smiles but stayed with conditions. Scholars from the University of the West Indies have repeatedly emphasized that sovereignty is impossible without structural ownership of land, water, agriculture, and key industries. This is not imagination. This is economic law. Fanai doit trencach ngien ku kong kaive Caribbean economies. Neuban muon chi tiet hon. Toiko the liet keje tranbaya. The second step is nurturing a generation of disciplined leadership. Not leadership built on speeches. Not leadership built on photo opportunities. Leadership built, as seen in Burkina Faso, on accountability and service. Caribbean youth, for the first time in many years, are hungry for models of governance that do not mock their intelligence. They want leaders who speak plainly, stand firmly, and act consistently. The third step is cutting unnecessary dependency. Not cutting partnerships, but cutting the invisible ropes that bind policymaking to external approval. The Caribbean must learn what many African states are rediscovering. A nation cannot negotiate its dignity from a place of weakness. There must be structure, alignment, and intention. The fourth step, my elders, is perhaps the most powerful: rebuilding the Caribbean-Africa bridge. For centuries, the connection between these two regions has been emotional, cultural, spiritual, but rarely strategic. Now, for the first time in living memory, academic and political channels are opening. When Caribbean scholars study the Sahel's governance, they are not imitating, they are reconnecting. They are reaching across the Atlantic to reclaim memory, reclaim dignity, and reclaim the right to shape their own future. And the fifth step, the step that determines whether everything changes or nothing changes, is public courage. Will the Caribbean public continue demanding accountability? Will they continue reading, questioning, and confronting long-accepted patterns? Will they insist that their leaders rise to meet the standards they admire abroad? Because no matter how inspiring the model of another nation may be, nothing will shift unless the people insist on rising with it. My family, the path ahead is steep, but it is not impossible. For the first time in a long time, the Caribbean is not only reacting to global movements, it is participating in them. It is shaping its own chapter. Yet the greatest test still lies beyond the horizon, waiting like a storm that no one can fully predict. For when a region begins reclaiming its dignity, the forces that once benefited from its passivity do not step aside quietly. And so, my elders, the question that hangs over the Caribbean now is this: when pressure arrives, and it will the region stand firm, or will old habits return to pull it back into silence? My elders, my brothers, my sisters, as we stand at the end of this long road of reflection, let us pause and breathe together. Let us hold the weight of what we have seen. From Kingston to Port of Spain, from Bridgetown to Basseterre, a quiet awakening has begun, one born not from speeches, but from study, not from noise, but from clarity. For the Caribbean to examine the governance approach rising out of Ouagadougou is more than an academic exercise. It is a reclaiming of memory. It is a realization that dignity is not a dream to be admired from afar, but a structure that can be built with patience and discipline. This entire journey has carried within it a deep, unmistakable echo that many are now calling an Ibrahim Traoré moment for the Caribbean, a chance to rediscover the sovereignty that slipped through the region's fingers decades ago. And yet, my family, this awakening is not just regional. Across the Atlantic, African-American elders have listened to this story with eyes that remember. You have felt the pain of delay. You have felt the sting of promises unfulfilled. You recognize what it means when a people rise from the margins and decide they will not return to silence. The Caribbean's awakening carries within it the same energy, the same longing, the same fierce desire to stand upright before the world. It is no surprise that the global ripple, what some have described as an Ibrahim Traoré reaction, has reached not only Africa, but the diaspora in Europe and the United States. For when one black nation stands, others feel the tremor. When one nation draws a boundary, others remember their own. And when one nation lifts its dignity, the entire family feels taller. But my elders, hear me clearly. None of this will matter if the Caribbean returns to old habits. None of this will matter if the youth stop asking questions. None of this will matter if leaders continue choosing convenience over courage. The future depends not on admiration, but on action, on whether the region turns this spark into structure, this curiosity into change. So I ask you, my family, will the Caribbean seize this second Ibrahim Traoré moment, or will fear and pressure drown it before it rises? What do you believe will happen next? Before you leave, if this message stirred something deep within you, make sure you subscribe, share this with another elder, and let your voice be heard in the comments. Tell me, Do you believe the Caribbean is ready to walk the path of dignity, or is the old world still too heavy on its shoulders?